Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a follow-up to a video I did a couple of weeks ago now, I think. So in that video, I talked about books that were underhyped that I think people should read, which I will leave linked in the cards above. And in this book, I'm going to be recommending to you books that you will definitely already have heard of and trying to convince you that they are good. It's not just hype. So I have 10 books to talk to you about, and these are all books that I have heard a lot about on BookTube and Bookstagram, but I don't know, they could just be hyped in my little bubble rather than generally hyped. I'm not going to be recommending you any Colleen Hoover or any Sarah J Maas. These are going to be like literary and historical fiction, but that I think seem pretty hyped to me. Anyway, some of them have won like international book prizes, so I think that that's pretty hyped. The first one on my list is one that is probably my favourite read of this year, and that is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And this is a very short piece of Korean fiction, which was translated by Deborah White. And it is a really strange little book, but it is one that I heard loads of people talking about years ago when it first came out on Bookstagram, on BookTube. And I finally got around to reading this year, and I'm so glad I did because it definitely lived up to the hype for me. It is about a woman who has a dream, a nightmare, and decides to give up eating meat. However, that's kind of just the premise. It is about the people in her life and the control they have of her and the like strictures of such a structured society. So we follow this from the perspective of her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister as they try to get her to eat and try to convince her that she must eat in the way that they have prescribed for her, and it slowly devolves over the course of time. I've heard that it is a retelling of a Greek myth, and I couldn't really think of what one it might be except potentially Daphne and Apollo. So do let me know in the comments if you do know, because I tried to look it up and I couldn't see it anywhere. It is a very like detached voice, the style of writing, and I really didn't get on with that in the first section, but as we moved through I realised that that was more to do with the character's perspective rather than the style of writing itself that I was struggling with, and that was on purpose. He was meant to be so grating that it was really hard to read, but once I got through, which is not that difficult considering it's such a short book, I really enjoyed it. It has themes of art and sex and sexual abuse, sexual coercion, sexual control, and of that as a kind of metaphor for control more broadly. And it has such really lovely language, really beautiful, and it is a really bizarre little book, but the images are so very strong, and that's what I really loved about it. So if you've been putting it off because if you weren't sure whether it was worth the hype, I would definitely say that it is. Next one that is kind of a Marmite book, I think, is Normal People by Sally Rooney. I didn't read this for ages because I am one of those people that if you tell me I must do something, I instantly get turned off. If lots of people are reading something or watching something, I never get around to it. I've never seen Breaking Bad for that very reason. But when I finally did get around to reading Normal People, I absolutely fell in love with it. And I know that a lot of people struggle with the lack of speech marks as well throughout. Lack of speech marks has never really bothered me. I think it shows the flow between their thoughts and their feelings and their spoken words, and it kind of allows for a liquidity in the language that I think is really lovely and really speaks to their mind frame. The idea that they never speak to one another and they never communicate. I saw a TikTok recently that was like a translator for Irish men on dates. The idea that people are like closed and repressed like is a big part of the culture and a big part of the book as well. I think that the way that it gets really inside the heads of these two people, of Connell and Marianne, and it makes you very uncomfortable. I never told you what it was about. It's about Connell and Marianne who are go to the same school in rural Ireland near Sligo, and they start dating one another, but they keep it a secret. Marianne is very unpopular at school, but Connell's mum works as a cleaner, and she's a single mum, and she works as a cleaner for Marianne's family, and there's like a lot of stigma attached to both his relative poverty and also his mum being a single mum. And eventually they end up moving to Dublin to go to university, and kind of their world changes and their roles changes, and it's about them finding their place in society, and the kind of subtle class markers and the distinctions in the way people like look down on Connell because of his rural accent and because of his not having access to the culture that other people who he goes to university with have had. It explores like sex again and intimacy and how those two things are not necessarily connected. I think it really gets deeply into the psychology of these two characters, and I really enjoyed that. And I think that the lack of communication makes perfect sense for who these characters are and where these characters are from. I know that it's something that other people who are more forthright might find difficult. Next is Still Life by Sarah Winman, and this book was just so incredibly charming and lovely that I'm really glad I read it. And I think that if you are looking for like a warm, cozy, comforting read that is not underestimating your intelligence, then I think Still Life would be perfect for you. It is about Ulysses, who is from the East End of London, and he is fighting in the Second World War, and he's in Italy towards the end of the war, and he meets this woman Evelyn, who is helping about getting the art that the Nazis have stolen back to where it should be from. And she tells him to go to Florence because she says he will have a wonderful time there, and something happens in Florence. But he ends up going back to London, and we meet this kind of ragtag group of chosen family who all work and or frequent this pub in the East End, and I really love that part of it because I worked in pubs for a very long time, and the characters there felt very recognisable to me, and I really enjoyed the warmth and the coziness of that. And eventually they end up back in Florence. Ulysses and some of the other characters end up coming with him, and it travels across the 20th century from the Second World War forwards, exploring the lives of these characters. It is so beautifully evocative. It really is a wonderful visual book because it deals a lot with art as well, and I think it does so in a really lovely way in all various different forms, and the sacrifices that people will make. It's a funny book, it's a queer book, it's got so much heart to it, and it's really just wonderful, but also really wonderfully written. I felt like it reminded me of reading some of my favourite classics in the times of the style of writing, but obviously it had a more expansive cast of characters than that. There was loads of moments of tragedy, like an epic flood, which was really wonderfully written and so moving. It always gives you hope for humanity in this book. It really writes that without being cloying or cheesy. It is always hopeful and it is always full of love, and I really enjoyed that for it. Next on my list is a children's book, which I don't read a lot of children's fiction, but I've read the series and I really loved it, and that is the Nevermoor series by Jessica Townsend. So we've got Nevermoor, The Trials of Morrigan Crow, Wanda Smith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow, and Hollowpox, the something else of Morrigan Crow. But this is a series of children's books set in a world where there's the Republic and there is the Free State, and the people in the Republic don't know about the Free State. Main character Morrigan Crow is from the Republic, but she ends up going to the Free State to flee because she's been a cursed child and she thought she was going to die on her 11th birthday. But Jupiter North rescues her and she ends up in the Free State. And she's trying to get into this society where you can get into if you have a knack, which is like a special skill or a talent, or some of them are more magical, but she doesn't have a knack, and so she's trying to get in. And this is kind of the basis of the first book, and then in the further books we see an unraveling of what's really going on in this world, what's behind everything. But it is a really magical book. I think it really brings the spirit of like reading children's fiction as a child for the first time. It's a book when I worked in a library that I recommended to a lot of children, and had a lot of children tell me it was their new favourite book, and so I think it really does work for all ages. It has again such heart, and the characters are perfectly kooky, but at the same time feel like the relationships between them all feel really grounded. You can understand their motivations and the emotions of all the characters, and I really enjoyed it. There's like bits of Christmas in there, so it does feel very festive as well. But I think it's a really wonderful children's book if you are looking for some of that magic. The winner of last year's Booker Prize, The Promise by Damon Galgut. I read the whole of the shortlist, which I'll leave linked to the cards above if you want to check it out, and The Promise ended up being my favourite book that I read last year. It is set in South Africa, beginning in the 1980s and going forward in time in these like time hops, about this family who are white Afrikaners who live near Pretoria, and they own a big farm and a lot of land, and the mother dies in the first section. On her deathbed, she makes her husband promise to give the house that their servant lives in, their black servant lives in, to give it to her. This is in the 1980s when she wouldn't have been allowed to own the property anyway, as far as I'm aware, but she wants it to be given to her if it at all possible. And the rest of the story is about how this family repeatedly breaks this promise. We follow the three siblings as they spread out through South Africa and each of the time periods that we go back to. It's an important time in the life of this family and also an important time in the life of South Africa, and it is written in such a wonderfully interesting way. We are inside the heads of all of these characters, and there is kind of a dark, sardonic humour, because the promises that these characters keep breaking to the black servants who work for them is also the promise that South Africa keeps breaking to the people. It flows through the different perspectives of all of these characters, and they are really flawed, really difficult people to read about, but I feel like they are so well evoked, and we can really understand them even if you hate them, or just really what the sun makes me want to roll my eyes so hard into the back of my head that I give myself a migraine. But I really enjoyed reading it, and like I said, the writing style is so interesting. It slips from first to second to third person, so sometimes it is talking from the perspective of an omniscient sort of floating narrator who seems to like drift into each of the characters' heads to hear from their perspective, but sometimes it's talking directly to you, the reader, and you see yourself reflected in the book, and I just think it's really, really wonderful. So skillfully written, so funny, so powerful, and I absolutely loved it. Next I have Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward, and Jesmyn Ward is definitely a writer that I have heard so much about on BookTube, all of her books. I have really heard praised. Sing Unburied Sing is the only one I have yet read, but I absolutely adored it. This is set in the American South, and it is about Leonie and her son Jojo and her father Rivers, and these are the characters from whose perspective we hear. And it is set ostensibly over the course of a few days as Leonie and her children travel with her friend to a prison. Jojo and his sister's father is being released, so we follow them over the course of these few days as they do this, but we also see their relationships as they all live together in a house with Leonie's mother and father, and her mother is very sick, and we hear the stories of her father who was in that prison several decades earlier, and so we see what that prison was like in a Jim Crow South, or a post Jim Crow South, the mostly black inmates picking cotton in the hot sun. Jojo, who is the son of who is Leonie's son, he's travelling with them. He is a very sensitive child, and there are elements of ghosts and hauntings that are happening, and that is how we hear the story of what happened in the past. Dreamlike book in a lot of the ways that it's written, so with the perspective of this very sensitive son and his perceptions of ghosts and of all of his family, and then also from the mother Leonie, who is an addict, and the writing from hers feels like this beautiful poetic trip. It feels really unmoored and like coming apart at the seams in a way that feels really like magical and difficult to connect to, very disjointed, but I think that it really works to get you in the headspace, and it feels like it has that kind of southern gothic kind of feeling imbued in it. It talks about police brutality and the prison industrial complex, and the breaking down of black families. It's so beautiful and so subtle, and it feels like it's just so well builds upon itself until you feel the like emotion overwhelm you. It is a really beautiful, really sad, really wonderfully told story, some of the best writing that I've read, so I definitely need to read more Jesmyn Ward. Another book I read on this channel a few years ago and really loved was The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This is historical fiction that's set in, I think it's set in Norway, but the island is called Finnmark, which I find confusing, but I'm sure that the Scandinavians don't. God, it's one of those is not Scandinavia, is it? The Nordic countries don't. Anyway, it is about a group of women on this very cold island off the north coast of Norway, where a lot of the men have died in a storm, and it is based on a true story. And so the vast majority of people in this town are women, and they are working together to keep the town going and to stop themselves starving to death. But the king of Denmark, which I believe was in charge of Norway at the time, is suspicious of witches, and he is sending men all over his dominion to hunt out witches, and he ends up sending this man north to Finnmark to see what is going on. And on his way, this man picks up a wife. It's a small town, and the women who turn against one another, or the women who like connect to one another. It is about like expanding gender norms and women who are working in a different way and acting a different way than they have been previously allowed with the strictures of the society. It is also about the Sami people and the persecution of the Samis, and It is a really slow moving book. There is not a lot that happens. There is a queer love story as well at the heart of it, but in such a like slow moving, delicate way. It is really such wonderful writing, really evocative of this cold, icy place. It is a book where not a lot is said, again, between the characters, and you have to read between the lines. Atmosphere of the book is really what draws you on. It is one with witch hunts and with torture, and like the abuse of women is a big part of the book, so look up trigger warnings, etc. But I think that it is so wonderfully done, so dark and gothic and really, really atmospheric. One of the most atmospheric books I've read, and I really enjoyed that about it. It is the perfect like winter read that is not at all cozy, but it is, yeah, just like I said, just so atmospheric, and I think perfect for this time of year. One that absolutely everyone was raving about when it came out is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennet, and I did enjoy this book. This is based on Passing by Nella Larson, which I haven't read, but it is about two sisters who live in this town in Louisiana, I think, a mostly black town, but it is a town that's obsessed with lightness of skin, and they are all light-skinned black people. These two sisters are very fair and very beautiful. They decide to go to New Orleans, and then one of them decides to pass as white, and she marries a white man and lives the rest of her life passing as white, whereas the other sister ends up in a relationship with a very dark-skinned black man and having a dark-skinned black child, and she ends up moving away to be in this relationship with him, which then turns bad, so she comes back to her hometown, bringing with her her very dark-skinned child who has such a horrible time in this town. So it's about the two sisters and their experiences, but it's also about both of their daughters. So we follow these two girls growing up and their mothers, and so the mother who's passed as white, her constant fear, and the racism of the community in which she lives. I think it's from the 50s to the 80s. The other sister back home, her experience with her mother and her mother's colorism towards her daughter, and that daughter's moving away from her family and her relationships with other people as well. And it is quite a short book that does manage to put quite a lot in it, but it is mostly about the relationships between people and the characters themselves. There are moments of extreme violence in this book, but they are mostly talked around rather than directly described, but that violence is always present, and the feeling of threat is ever present in this book, this feeling of discomfort and of something is always going to happen, something could happen at any moment, so all of our characters have like a very tense feeling to them. It's a book with a lot of tension even within the relationships. There are some really lovely warm relationships as well. There is the other side of the coin, but a lot of our characters never feel able to relax regardless of the comfort of the relationship in which they find themselves. It is sometimes a little less subtle than it could have been, but for the most part I really enjoyed it and thought that the writing was really well done, but particularly the characters I think is what this stands out for this book. One that is again a little more commercial but that I really enjoyed is Queenie by Candice Carty Williams. I know a lot of people have really loved this book. It is another one that's really hyped, and it is about a young black woman working in London in publishing. I think she works in publishing. There is something that happened to her in her past that we don't know what it is, but we know that it is there and it is kind of haunting her. She's been broken up with at the beginning of the book, I believe, and we just follow her along in a kind of a slice of life way. We see her relationships with other people, again, the way she uses sex as a form of self-harm, the way that she interacts with people in relationships, romantic relationships, and with herself, her own body and her own like boundaries, her own protection of herself, and the way that she will not protect that a lot of the time. It's also a book that deals with female friendship and with workplace relationships and with her relationships with her family and mental health. I think Queenie's mental health is kind of the centre of the book. A difficult read. A lot of the time I felt like it was quite hard going, especially if you're someone who's ever been in a similar mental place to Queenie in terms of her mental health and her relationships to the world. But it's also really compelling and really quite an easy read. There's a lot of like iMessenger and like funny friendship moments that make it like compelling and easy to read, even though it's a difficult read, if that makes sense. It's not one that's difficult to read because of the structure or the style of writing. The style of writing itself is quite amusing and compelling, but the subject matter is what makes it difficult. I also really enjoyed the side of London that it showed. I think that that's a side of London I'm more familiar with. It's set in southeast London, which is where I'm from. They go to the Crystal Palace fireworks in the book, and I am from Crystal Palace. Those are the fireworks I grew up going to. So for me, it's like my part of London. They spend a lot of time in Brixton, so I'm like really recognise a lot of the places that they are talking about, but also like that side of London I feel like is not always shown in books, and I really enjoyed that part of it as well. And then finally, the final book that is very hyped, that I love, that I don't think I could make this video without talking about, is Wolfhall by Hilary Mantel. Of course, I talk about it all the time. It's probably my favourite book of all time, definitely my favourite series of all time. And yeah, 2 of the books won the Booker Prize and the other one was longlisted, so definitely a hyped book. There's been a TV series, there's been a play. Yeah, it's a hyped book, but one that is so worth it. Although it's another one that I think can be a bit Marmite, because I think some people find it difficult to get on with, but I absolutely adore it. It is about Thomas Cromwell. We follow Thomas Cromwell, who was Cardinal Wolsey's right-hand man and then Henry VIII's right-hand man through the course of the 16th century, Henry VIII's reign, kind of from the moment of Catherine of Aragon's slow decline and to the end of, and to Anne of Cleves and the disaster of Anne of Cleves. So we've got quite a span of Henry VIII's life, and all of these books are just so wonderful. This one starts with Thomas as a young man, but we get quite quickly into Henry trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and it ends with the death of Thomas More. And then the second book is from the marriage of Anne Boleyn to the death of Anne Boleyn. And then the third book picks up right where the second book ends and finishes with the death of Thomas Cromwell. And I don't think any of those things are spoilers, because these people were executed nearly 500 years ago. So wonderful. It is the best piece of historical fiction. If you like historical fiction, it is so evocative of the time period. It feels like you're reading candlelit rooms. It is so brilliantly woven, this character. You understand every perspective of him, and he is a character who is much like villainized in our historical memory in the UK, but he is such an interesting character, and it's so empathetic. He feels very much like a real person. And the writing is gorgeous. The way that it drifts into dreams, into recollections, it will interrupt itself in the middle of thoughts in a way that feels like you are kind of very privy to Thomas Cromwell's thoughts, and you are it's very immediate. It's all written in the present tense. She works so well with dramatic irony, the way that you know that these people are going to die, you know what's going to happen, and yet you are still like on the edge of your seat, hoping that things don't go the way that you know they inevitably have to. I think it's just so wonderful the way that she manages to do that, to make 500-year-old history feel like it's happening right now. And it's so beautiful. I love her writing. I just want to live in her writing. I think that the words, the way she structures sentences even, I just absolutely adore. So I do have an entire review of that series if you want to see me talk about it for 20 whole minutes, because clearly I can do that. I feel like I could talk about it non-stop. But I'm going to stop now. So those are 10 books that I think are definitely worth the hype. If you've been putting them off for fear of them not living up to it, I can assure you that they will, or at least they did for me. Please let me know in the comments down below your favourite book that everyone loves. I would love to hear what you have to say, and I will be back again soon with another video. I put out new videos twice a week, so remember to like this one, to subscribe, to do all of that thing, as you can check out my Instagram, various different things going on over there, and so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.